The war between the United States and Iran has entered one of the most dangerous and unpredictable phases in modern geopolitical history, evolving from a fast-moving military confrontation into a multi-layered global crisis with far-reaching consequences. What initially began as a coordinated escalation in late February 2026, when the United States and Israel launched strikes targeting Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure, has now expanded into a regional conflict involving multiple countries, rising economic instability, and increasing risk of a broader war. At the center of this escalating crisis lies the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically vital maritime passages in the world. This narrow waterway carries roughly 20% of global oil supply, making it not just a regional choke point, but a lifeline for the global economy. The disruption of this route has already triggered what experts are calling one of the largest energy shocks in history, with ripple effects being felt far beyond the Middle East. Since the outbreak of the war, Iran has effectively asserted control over the strait, severely restricting commercial shipping. Tanker traffic has collapsed dramatically, in some cases dropping by more than 90%, while insurance costs for vessels have surged multiple times over normal levels. This has created an environment where many shipping companies simply refuse to risk transit through the region, further tightening global supply chains and intensifying economic pressure worldwide. Iran's actions have gone beyond simple disruption. Reports indicate that Tehran is actively shaping access to the strait based on geopolitical alignment, allowing certain nations to pass while restricting others. In addition, Iran's parliament has moved to impose tolls on ships, in some cases reaching millions of dollars per vessel, effectively turning one of the world's most important trade routes into a geopolitical bargaining tool. The consequences of these actions are already unfolding. Energy markets have entered a state of extreme volatility, with analysts warning that if the situation continues, oil prices could surge to as high as $200 per barrel. Such a spike would not only impact fuel costs, but could trigger a global recession, disrupt industries, and strain economies across both developed and developing nations. Against this backdrop, the United Arab Emirates is undergoing a dramatic and historic shift in its foreign policy. For years, the UAE maintained a careful balancing act between its alliance with the United States and its economic ties with Iran. Dubai, in particular, served as a major commercial hub with deep financial links to Tehran, facilitating trade and acting as a gateway for regional business. However, the ongoing war has fundamentally altered that equation. Following repeated missile and drone attacks targeting Gulf countries, including the UAE itself, the nation is now reconsidering its position. Recent reports suggest that the UAE is actively exploring the possibility of joining a military effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Officials in Abu Dhabi are reportedly pushing for the formation of an international coalition that would use force if necessary to restore freedom of navigation. This potential move represents a major turning point. If the UAE proceeds, it could become the first Gulf country to directly enter the conflict as a combatant, marking a significant escalation in the war. Behind the scenes, Emirati diplomats are working aggressively to build support for this initiative. They are lobbying for a United Nations Security Council resolution that would authorize military action to secure the strait, while also encouraging major powers in Europe and Asia to participate in a coalition force. At the same time, discussions are underway regarding specific military roles that the UAE could take on. These include mine-clearing operations, naval escort missions, and potentially direct combat participation. There have even been reports of strategic considerations involving contested territories, including islands such as Abu Musa, which remains under Iranian control but is claimed by the UAE. This shift is not happening in isolation. Other Gulf states, including Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, are increasingly aligning themselves against Iran. Bahrain, in particular, has taken an active diplomatic role by circulating a draft resolution at the United Nations aimed at protecting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. The resolution calls for multinational cooperation and allows for the use of all necessary means to ensure safe maritime navigation. However, it has been revised to remove binding enforcement provisions reflecting the complex geopolitical realities and the likelihood of opposition from countries such as Russia and China. Even without a binding resolution, momentum is building toward the formation of a coalition naval force. Such a force would likely include escorting commercial vessels, clearing mines, and potentially engaging Iranian forces directly if necessary. Meanwhile, the United States strategy appears increasingly complex and at times contradictory. On one hand, the U.S. has conducted extensive military operations targeting Iranian capabilities. Since the beginning of the conflict, thousands of targets have reportedly been struck, with a focus on weakening Iran's navy, missile systems, and defense infrastructure. On the other hand, President Donald Trump has signaled that he may be willing to end the war even if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. This represents a significant shift from earlier positions that emphasized reopening the strait as a primary objective. Trump has suggested that the strait could reopen automatically after a U.S. withdrawal and has indicated that other nations, particularly those dependent on the waterway, should take responsibility for securing it. This shift appears to be driven in part by concerns over the duration of the conflict. A full-scale military effort to reopen the strait could significantly extend the war, something the administration seems eager to avoid. Instead, the focus has been on achieving core military objectives within a limited time frame before transitioning to diplomacy. However, this approach has raised serious concerns among analysts and policymakers. Critics argue that ending military operations without resolving the status of the Strait of Hormuz could leave a critical vulnerability in place with long-term consequences for global stability. At the same time, military activity in the region continues to expand. U.S. forces remain heavily deployed across the Middle East, with naval, air, and ground units positioned to respond to a range of scenarios. This dual-track strategy, pursuing diplomacy while maintaining military pressure, has created uncertainty about the administration's true intentions. It has also raised questions among both allies and adversaries about the potential for further escalation. Officials have emphasized that the president remains focused on achieving the objectives of the ongoing military campaign. The president is focused on achieving the objectives of Operation Epic Fury, she said. They have also reiterated that diplomacy remains a central priority. Diplomacy is his number one option and priority, she said. At the same time, the administration has refused to rule out further escalation, including the possibility of ground operations. The president has obviously declined to rule them out, she said. Officials have stressed that any such decisions will be made in accordance with U.S. law and congressional oversight. The administration will, of course, always abide by Congress and the rule of law, she said. As the conflict continues, its economic impact is becoming increasingly severe. The disruption of the Strait of Hormuz has already led to fuel shortages, rising inflation, and supply chain disruptions across multiple regions. Countries heavily dependent on energy imports are facing particularly acute challenges. Emergency measures are being implemented in several regions, while industries reliant on energy, including transportation, agriculture, and manufacturing, are experiencing mounting pressure. The crisis has also triggered significant volatility in global financial markets. While some investors are optimistic about a potential end to the conflict, others remain deeply concerned about the unresolved issues surrounding the strait and the risk of further escalation. Experts warn that the longer the strait remains disrupted, the more severe the economic consequences will become. They emphasize that energy markets are deeply interconnected, meaning that disruptions in one region can quickly spread across the global economy. The situation remains highly volatile. Iran has shown no indication of backing down, continuing missile and drone attacks across the region, including strikes on Gulf countries and critical infrastructure. At the same time, the possibility of additional countries entering the conflict is increasing. The potential involvement of the UAE and possibly other Gulf states raises the risk of a broader regional war that could draw in multiple powers and significantly alter the balance of power in the Middle East. Warnings have already been issued by regional actors. Iran-backed groups have signaled that any attempt to forcibly reopen the strait could trigger retaliation, further escalating the conflict and increasing the risk of a wider confrontation. This moment represents a defining turning point not just for the Middle East, but for the global order as a whole. The decisions made in the coming weeks, whether to escalate militarily, pursue diplomacy, or attempt a combination of both, will shape the future of the region and the global economy for years to come. For the United Arab Emirates, the decision to move closer to military involvement marks a fundamental shift in its role within the region, from a neutral economic hub to a potential frontline participant in a major conflict. For the United States, the challenge lies in balancing its strategic objectives with the risks of escalation while managing alliances and maintaining global economic stability. And for the rest of the world, the stakes could not be higher. With one of the most critical energy lifelines under threat, the outcome of this conflict will determine not only the trajectory of the war itself, but the future of global stability. The war between the United States and Iran is no longer a contained confrontation. It has evolved into a complex and interconnected crisis involving military strategy, economic survival, and geopolitical power. As tensions continue to rise and as more nations consider stepping into the conflict, the world is watching closely. The coming days and weeks will be critical in determining whether this crisis moves toward resolution or spirals into something far more dangerous.